This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
So I'm going to give a talk on this talk that Bhante gave, Sangharakshita gave in 1975, yeah? And I'm just going to riff off his lecture that he gave. Yeah, which has been quite an interesting process, actually. I mean, it's been a beautiful process in a way. So I start off with a bit of content, like some of the things he's saying, and looking at that, yeah? And then I begin to realise that I think what he's trying to do is gradually kind of change our idea about what this so-called spiritual life is about and take the romance out of it and firmly ground it in life. He's just saying, it's life. Engage with life, yeah? You know, when you're looking for something kind of esoteric or whatever, look here right now and see what's going on. So I've been thinking about... so he gave this lecture in 1975. By then, he'd been running meditation classes since 1967. How old is that? That's like
8 years.
8 years. Okay, so he's been running meditation classes for 8 years. And there's a few order members now. And the eldest ones are 6 years old. Okay, so this is the movement that we're engaged with. And he's addressing a crowd probably in the Buddhist Society. I mean, he's being hosted or chaired by Christmas Humphreys, which means, I mean, he founded the London Buddhist Society, so I'm imagining that's probably where Sangharakshita was when he gave this lecture. So he knows what his audience is. His audience is going to be middle-class, white, intellectual, probably, and he's got a bunch of hippies that are also getting involved on the sidelines, and people like Sona, who's 1 year old in the order. So this is the kind of mixture that he's got, okay, in front of him. And he's trying to... A lot of the lectures that he's giving us at this time he's trying to work out, what am I really trying to do with Buddhism in the West? What kind of movement am I trying to set up? So sometimes when you look at these early lectures, you begin to see the seeds of what we now take more for granted, yes? Yeah, another very early lecture, he talks about the incrustations of kind of religious and cultural trappings, or let's call them trappings at the moment, that get kind of placed on Buddhism. So, for instance, Indian Buddhism is just Indian Buddhism. So it's been developed in India, where people wear, in India at that time, in medieval India, they're wearing certain clothes, there's certain sort of insignia that go with being a renunciant. And eventually then religion becomes very, structured, established and structured, yeah, in a certain kind of way. And then that Buddhism moves on into China, and the Chinese have got their own culture, their own way of doing stuff, their own way, even the way that their mind works, yeah. For instance, Chinese Buddhism is always dated in a way that Indian Buddhism isn't. For instance, because they were interested in history and dates, in that their mind was more interested in that. And then it goes to Japan. Now, Japan's got again a very, very different culture. A lot around, just the whole society was framed in a certain way with a certain kind of aesthetics that go with houses and stuff like that. And Buddhism goes into that. And we get Zen, which looks a particular way, looks very different from Indian Buddhism, or very different from Tibetan Buddhism. So then Bhante's trying to work out, or Sangharakshita's trying to work out, what is the Dharma, what is Buddhism, when it isn't Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Tibetan? When you take all that away, what is it you've got left? Yeah. And mostly what you've got left is life, and how we engage with life within the context of values. And there are certain techniques and there are certain teachings that we can take into Buddhism that's universal, but that's got to come into our life, yeah? This is where he's going, very subtly. Yeah. So he's got in front of him in the West, and, well, everywhere actually, he's got people looking for something. We're looking for something. We're looking for something that's going to give our life meaning, that's going to frame our life in a way that gives it purpose or direction. It's going to give us a reason to get up in the morning. I remember seeing this very strongly for myself on a solitary retreat I was doing as a young woman. I realised how strong the need for meaning in my life was. Otherwise, I thought, why would I get up in the morning? I don't know what's going to get me up in the morning, actually, from now on. It's like, you can work, you can earn money, you can buy nice things, but really, then what happens? What motivates us to engage, I suppose, with life, or what motivates us to get up in the morning? Yeah. For me personally, it's become a life of meaning and of learning. Learning's just super important. Like when you're learning something, you feel alive, don't you? I remember reading a book once when a child had been born with very strong disabilities, and the mother was trying to get him to do certain things, and she was offering him ice cream, and then his teacher showed him how to do something, and he got very, very excited about this, and the tutor said, children want to learn more than they want to eat, which I thought was such a beautiful expression. And I thought, actually, that might be true for us. When we feel we're creative and we're learning, then we feel like we've got an appetite and we've got something going in that we really want, yeah, which is more than ice cream or fancy items or something. Yeah? So a life of learning. So Sangharakshita's got in front of him people that are looking for something, and they think Buddhism's going to give it to them, the Dharma's going to give it to them. But they're practicing it very much in evening classes. They're practicing it very much on the side, and they're looking for something that's going to be something which they can sort of acquire to their lives. A bit like, I don't know, a new Apple Mac or something like that. Something that's kind of they're going to acquire and they're going to add on into their life. They're going to look for experience, and we're all looking for an experience. We're looking for an experience because our life is quite flat, and also we're looking for an experience which gives us a sense that we're on the right track, and we're looking for an experience which that is exciting to engage with, because often we're not very connected with ourselves. So because we're not very connected with ourselves, we're looking for something big that gives us something to get our teeth into, gives us something to connect with. I mean, often when we fall in love with people, actually, we think it's the person we fall in love with, but I think often what it is an experience of ourselves which we really love. Often the experience of ourself in love is actually quite unusual. It's very free-flowing, it's expansive, it feels very, it feels like all our chakras are all open, to use that expression, yeah? And that's what we really fall in love with, and that particular person gives us that experience. So just see where you, how you engage with your experience, and where you look for a life. Where do you look for life in your experience? And often our attitude towards experience, which Sangharakshita brings out in this lecture, is that we appropriate it often. I learnt this the hard way myself. Or maybe not the hard way, but I learnt this through self-reflection and beginning to understand the kind of woman that I was. So at some point I realised life was very, very intense. Life is very intense for me at that time. And then I realised it wasn't life, it was me that was intense. And then I began to look at what I was doing, and I began to realise that I was greedily appropriating experience all the time. And I wanted some experience, and I didn't want other experience. So often we have views about ourselves. I'm a kind person, as a view. And then we appropriate all the experience that tells us that's true. The way that person smiled at us, the way that we were very helpful in signing up to wash up supper, the way that we offered advice, all of this becomes experience that tells us we're kind, and we begin to kind of appropriate it and add it on, a bit like Christmas decorations on a tree. We add it on to ourselves. Yeah? We also distance ourselves with certain behaviour. Like we notice somebody over there is a bit irritable, and we think, I'm not like that. So often our relationship with others is what we're trying to tell ourselves. Yeah? What we get attracted to is what we're trying to tell ourselves, and often what we don't like or what we don't want to be, we notice in other people and we disassociate with them. Just noticing that. So we begin to try and appropriate experience to tell us that we're having an experience, to tell us that we're having a spiritual life even. We're having a spiritual life because we've had this very strong experience of, well, let's say in meditation, or we've had this exotic moment of communication. And we're trying to appropriate something which tells us that we're getting somewhere. And this is just, in a way, it's just what we're doing all the time. It's just that we then do it with the spiritual life, this so-called spiritual life. We begin to do it with that. So then Sangharakshita begins to discriminate between these two things of attainment and appropriation. So he says, you can appropriate experience. In other words, you can say, I've had an experience, which means I'm a spiritual person, and you can gradually grow into being a bigger person, and gradually you attain the qualities that you really want, and that looks very different. When I was a young woman in Glasgow, I remember one of the Dharmacharis that were living in Glasgow, one of the male order members up there, he suddenly said to me, what are you doing in your meditation right now? And I said, I'm practicing stillness, simplicity, and contentment. Yeah, and I was doing that because I was getting into a lot of very strong trains of thought around certain issues in my life. And I began to notice this is not leading to simplicity. This is leading to complexity. Or this is not leading to stillness. This is leading to agitation. And I thought, I'm just going to practice stillness, simplicity, and contentment in my meditation so that I do not engage with those scenarios so much. They're not going to dominate me so much. I'd recently finished a relationship, a romantic relationship, and I was having all sorts of scenarios about what would happen when we met each other. Yeah, I would say this, then they would say that, then I would say this, then that, then we'd sort something out. This was going on all the time, and I thought, this is crazy, I do not want to do this. Anyway, this order member said, oh, that's interesting. Your body language has completely changed in the last few weeks. So I didn't know that was happening, but that was just a natural growth out of the Dharma practice that I was putting in place in my life. I wasn't trying to kind of, appropriate behaviour. I was growing into behaviour. It's slightly different. So just, so on this weekend, you could just look at where appropriation shows up in your experience. Just notice where you may be, you'll hear yourself saying something, and we're all doing this all the time. We say things that shore up our own view about ourselves. Sometimes it's just simply you're just noticing something that you've done, but then notice what that does and where you put it in your sort of whole makeup, as it were. So then Sangharakshita goes into talking about these three syndromes that in a way, happens when we're expecting life to give us something. So you can get into this mode of thinking life will give you something, the spirit, and you're going to get a spiritual life. Where are you going to get a spiritual life from? I'm going to go out there and get a spiritual life. This is what I need to answer all the kind of unpleasant, unhappiness in me, the way my relationships are a bit dysfunctional, the way I'm not achieving what I want to achieve, or whatever. Where am I going to get that experience from? And he says that we can look in 3 places. We can look towards something exotic, sort of teachings, or a group, or a Buddhist movement that's exotic. Yeah. So, you get this idea that life isn't the spiritual life isn't going to be something that's ordinary and normal. It's going to look something very different. So you're going to try and find it somewhere, though it looks very different. I don't think this happens quite so much now, because so many teachings now are very kind of embodied by people that look quite ordinary, like the Insight Meditation Society in America. People aren't dressed differently or anything like that. They just look like people from America look like us, and so they don't look exotic in that way. So we've got more sort of accustomed to less exotic forms of Buddhism. But at this time, Tibetan teachers, red robes, shaved heads, beads, they were starting to move around London, and they were just new visitors. They were very exotic. Triratna's not very exotic, as you can see in the room. We don't look that exotic. But anyway, we look for something. We look for something exotic. And in a way, what is it? It's like, I think it's quite subtle, all this. I think, even though I'm so used to us just leading very ordinary lives, like when people say to me, "What do you do, Sadhananda, at a retreat centre?" I say, well, mostly it's hotel management, to be honest. I mean, that's what it is, isn't it, really, when you think about it? It's just putting food on tables and making sure the bed linen's on, and conjuring up a kind of list of events. It's probably more like a conference centre, really. So there's not much exoticness out of that. I think the danger of this, if you think I mustn't look for anything that's unusual, then the danger is then that you think everything's just very ordinary and flat. And actually, when you start engaging with yourself more fully, there is something really wonderful and opening about that isn't just ordinary. You can also sometimes think you don't need anything religious, like chanting maybe, or myself and Sona have got different names, more exotic names. They're very, very significant to us, and they encapsulate a whole sort of myth behind our lives, and they mean something very important to us. Yeah. And when we've named people, which both of us have done through ordination, it's a very significant mythic process that's happening there, which contextualizes sometimes that person's life or their qualities. When I was given my name, the woman that named me said, Rachel has now become Sadhanandi, and she said she's the first woman in this order to have the word faith, Sadha, in her name, and she has tremendous faith in the Buddha and the potential of enlightenment, and I invite her to take her faith into the order. That was what I was commissioned with. And it's very interesting to be given a name. You begin to realise then, with the name like to do with faith, for instance, it's very hard to be nihilistic, which is also a very strong tendency in me. Or even like, where does doubt fit in? Yeah, what does doubt look like when you've also got faith? But it contextualises your life in a very mythic way, and this is important. Then we have the kind of exoticness of people. So Bhante says we can look for something special to be happening somewhere and it's going to come from somewhere special, exotic, India, Tibet. It's not going to come from South London. Unfortunately, we did, but which isn't very, very exotic. But where should the Dharma life come from? Somewhere exotic. And then who should be communicating it? Well, someone exotic, someone who's a great guru, great teacher. They're going to look a certain way, and they're going to really believe in them, believe in themselves, and what they're going to be like. Well, you're going to project an idea about who they are. Their word is going to become like God, actually. If you think everything's in that person, then it's going to be very hard to question what they do. We've seen some of this happen, haven't we, in various spiritual movements where people who've got a lot of power when they've got, seemingly got a lot of spiritual authority, then people are very loath to question their behaviour when that behaviour does need to be questioned. And what is that? So then you start thinking, okay, I shouldn't be looking for anything special in a person. Everyone should just be exactly the same. But everyone isn't exactly the same. A lot of us have got a lot more under our belt in terms of spiritual experience or like growth than other people. And you have brought a lot of growth into the room. You've got a lot that you can contribute. So you can't just dismiss people. At the same time, you can't just believe people because they look a bit exotic or because they present as great teachers themselves. So how are you going to know that somebody's got something worth listening to? How are you going to know that for yourself? Sometimes we think we don't need other people, we just need to depend totally on ourselves. But actually other people can really help us grow and develop. So how are you going to work out those relationships? Where are you going to find those people? How are you going to know for yourself, that you can trust that person? That could take quite a long time. You also need to know yourself. You need to know whether you're susceptible to projections, to projecting on others. Some of us have more susceptibility than others in that area. And then we can look for experience through technique. Through technique in terms of meditation in particular. I think different Buddhist movements, different spiritual movements, if you like, have different techniques at the heart of their kind of body of teachings. I remember going on a retreat many years ago outside Triratna, and it was a very intensive meditation retreat. But every 2 days we did these very strong communication exercises, which surprised me because it wasn't a school of Buddhism where I thought we would do communication exercises. And I was asking the teachers about this, and they said, well, we've noticed that in our particular body of techniques, people can get very heady and alienated from their experience. They become, they're labelling their experience in a very detailed, intense way, but they do actually lose touch with who they are, and they lose touch with life in a way. So we've incorporated these communication techniques to try and adjust the balance. And I said, I hadn't realised that was needed. And they said, no, that's because you're from Triratna. It's not needed in Triratna. And I thought, that's probably true. Probably we need more of the other side. Yeah? So Buddhist movements grow up around different techniques. Yeah? And then you have phases where different techniques are more interesting to people than others. And this can suddenly kind of blossom. And then you notice people can get very evangelical about certain meditation techniques. They can also get very angry that they weren't taught it on day one, this sort of thing. All sorts of things can happen. Yeah? So we can think of technique in a particular way. But there's loads of different ways of developing ourselves. And we've all got different personalities, and personalities require different methods. So some people are going to take more to, they're going to practice more through communication than through meditation. They're going to practice more through the metta bhavana than the mindfulness of breathing. All of it's taking you in the same direction, and all of us have got personalities that need like different conditions, I suppose. Okay, so then Sangharakshita then goes on to talk about his title. So the title of the lecture is Experience. What is it? Enlightenment. Yes, enlightenment is experience and non-experience. So this sounds really super interesting, isn't it? Non-experience. Get super interested in non-experience. I've already seen someone who's super interested in that. And anyway, non-experience. So Bhante talks a little bit about cessation, how enlightenment is sometimes called cessation, nirodha. And this is interesting. I mean, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of cessation through meditation, but I will describe it in terms of relationship, because this is how I've learned more about cessation than anywhere else, just because that's my tendency. So this is rather a strong example, I'm afraid. It's a rather strong story, but I'll deliver it. So when I was at art school in Canterbury, I had a good friend, and you have special friends. You get into having special friends sometimes. And this person was a significant person in my college at this time. And she arrived at college one day and she was very restless and distracted. And then she said to me she wanted to speak to me during the tea break. And I agreed. And I got very anxious that she was going to tell me that she didn't want to be my friend. This is how I was framed. This is where I was going. And I met her. She said, "Do you mind if we go somewhere private?" And I said no. So we went somewhere private, and I expected her to deliver this news. And she told me instead that she'd been raped on the way home the night before, and she spent the night in a police station. And in that moment, I was very tearful. But I knew that I was tearful because she wasn't telling me the news I thought she was going to tell me. I wasn't tearful because of what she was telling me, but what she wasn't telling me. You see what I mean? And I knew that there was something wrong about that. So many, many years later, when I was teaching a lot of meditation retreats in Taraloka in Shropshire, and in particular I was teaching the Brahma Viharas meditations. So I'm teaching the practices of friendliness and love, of compassion, sympathetic joy, and of equanimity. And I'm analysing those meditations and thinking about how I'm going to teach them. And I'm thinking, what conditions allow those qualities to flourish, and what conditions dampen them down, mean they don't function. And then I thought about this incident with my friend, and I thought, when there's a lot of thoughts about self in the mix, then the Brahma Viharas, those qualities of love, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity will not arise. So the cessation of thoughts about self will allow you to naturally be more kind, more engaged, more sympathetic, more loving, whatever. So there's a path of cessation. I also remember after my father died, I was, what age? I was 33, 34 years old, and I'd been nursing him through that period. And I went on holiday with one of my best friends from the Glasgow Buddhist Centre. And as we were on our journey, she suddenly turned to me. She was an order member by then, and she suddenly turned to me and she said, "Do you think you might be ready for ordination?" And I said, why are you suddenly saying that? Is it something I've said? And she said, no, it's all the things you're no longer saying. So here's another moment of cessation. Sometimes it's not what we're saying, it's what we're not saying any longer. It's what's quiet in us that is the path, as it were, yeah? So, in a way, non-experience isn't so much there's some special thing, it's more like an absence, maybe, of the stuff that we usually do. How about you could think like that? So who would you be if you didn't do some of the things that you normally do? Some of the things that are internal to you, that you normally do. Who would you be without that? Okay then, so then Sangha actually goes in to talk about non-experience in 3 very ordinary ways. He talks about it in terms of growth, work, and duty. Doesn't sound terribly interesting, does it really? In comparison to cessation of conditions and non-experience. Growth, work, and duty. And when myself and Sona were talking about this yesterday, he said, it's totally obvious to me why it should be growth, work, and duty in that order, Sadhanandi. And he described it to me, but he can describe it to us even better, I'm sure, in a minute. He said, when we grow as human beings, we get all our energies flowing more freely, we're more able to just engage with life, and that growth or that flow needs to go somewhere. And that's because we need to work. That's where our energy needs to go. We need channels for that energy, and that's work. And then when we're working and we're engaging with that energy in that way, we've got to sort of turn towards our duty, and our duty is to life. Our duty is to our spiritual life and to our life around us. He's probably going to put this differently, but I'll just summarise it now. And it's turning towards all the things that in some ways we don't want to do. It's like giving up preferences and just be free-flowing into life. And it's interesting, this whole area of duty. I've got this, there's this cartoon book that I read quite a bit when I need to just wind down, called Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin and Hobbes. Does anybody know this cartoon books? You do, probably, because you know me. Calvin and Hobbes is this great character. So Calvin is a hyperactive 6-year-old boy, and Hobbes is his stuffed tiger. But Hobbes is really he's a philosopher. I think in real life he's a historical philosopher. So the tiger's totally pragmatic, and Hobbes is this hyper-energetic wee boy. And the father and mother are always trying to get Calvin to do things that he doesn't want to do, and eat the food that he doesn't want to do. That doesn't want to eat. And whenever he argues with him, whenever he argues with his father, the father says it will build character. And he always says, why do I know that all the things that build character are going to be things that I don't want to do? And I think duty is a bit like that. It's all the things that build character. More like things that, just our responsibility towards maybe our parents or our friends. I mean, there's sometimes these are joyful things, but responsibilities that we have to honour, yeah? And we want to honour them because we want those relationships, or we want to honour them because they're part of society, they're part of life. And at the same time, there's a bit of us that's pulling away from it sometimes, yeah? Anyway, we'll go into this. So let's look at growth. And Sangha actually talks about this totally in terms of us growing into ourselves. And he uses the metaphor a lot of growing like plants. In fact, one day when I went to see him, when he was living here, and I popped in to see him, and he suddenly said to me, after we said hello, he said, Sadhanandi, people don't realise that we grow more like plants. They don't realise how much we grow like plants. And I didn't know why he was saying this to me, but I suspect he'd been reading letters from order members where they were trying to describe their spiritual life in a much more kind of concrete, mechanical sort of way. And he thought, no, we grow more like plants than they realise. So what does this mean? This means it's an organic process. Yeah. growth is an organic process that's going to happen naturally, and it needs the right conditions. If you give it the right conditions, we will all just grow. We will all grow in terms of consciousness and in terms of awareness and in terms of connection. We will all just grow. And we're all going to grow into something a bit different. Yeah? Some people grow into oak trees, and some people grow into poppies. Yeah? And that requires different conditions. It looks very different sometimes. At the same time, it's all just plants. It's all just growth. It's all just organic. We could think of more like that about ourselves. And it also means that when a plant grows, like when a flower grows, first of all you get the stem, then you get the leaves, then you get more of the stem, then you get the bud, and then you get the flower. And all of that is just joined and connected. The flower isn't disconnected from the stem. And what he's also saying is that any attainment that we receive, any attainment that we gain is growing naturally from us, from inside out. It's not something which you can stick onto yourself. You can't be taught how to become. You can't be taught to walk in a stillness, simplicity and contentment sort of way. That has to grow from within. Otherwise it always looks like just some sort of strange flower you've stuck on yourself. And the conditions that nourish us are different. Different people need different conditions, and it's rich soil, like ritual, meditation, friendship, art, poetry, politics, people, communication, work, duty. All these things need to be part of our life. So for some people, some of those things are needed more than others. If you see what I mean, some people need more art than others. Some people need more poetry than others. Some people need more friendship than others. But we need rich soil out of which to grow. Then we've got work. Work is something that just channels and gives purpose to our life. And you want it to be work that allows you to live a life of value. Yeah? Live a life of value. So ideally your work would mirror the values that you have in your life. Your contribution to society, where it helps you to become more aware. It's serving others. There might be a number of ways that you look at your work in terms of service and contribution. If it isn't that, then maybe it just needs to be as small amount as possible for you to have the life that you really want to have, as it were. So how can you create this creative life through work? Is there a way of engaging with your work? I mean, this is something even I have to do here. Like, I notice I get very utilitarian about my work, and I get very busy and very complex around it. But my goodness, it's a very privileged life. Why don't I just function as if it's just this really super privileged creative life? And why does it need to be... I'm looking at women that live with me and they're all nodding. I'm learning this hard, okay? I'm learning this the slow way. I'm just gradually attaining this wisdom. Why do I have to engage with my work or my life in a way that burdens me and makes me feel sort of narrow and small? Why not engage with it in a way that I feel creative and big? Yeah. And then duty, our ability to turn towards life, turn towards the details of our life and honour it, if you like. Honour what's in there. Honour the relationships that we have. Honour the work that we need to do. Be conscientious in our life. Engage with life. So in this lecture, Sangharakshita is trying to, in a way, he's trying to engage our appetite for life. And know that if we can live a life of value, we will be living a spiritual life. We will be leading a life that's going to blossom into more awareness and a larger consciousness. I've had that experience myself. see how I'm going to summarise. So have you got words for your spiritual life that are too narrow for you, or artificial, or don't really sort of hold you in the life that you need? We used to do this sort of image work called creating a mandala. You create, let me think how to put this well. You look at your life as a mandala. Some people call it, is it mandala? I don't know how to pronounce it. So a mandala is, your life is like a kind of circle of people and activity. Yeah. But what have you got at the centre of that mandala? So that centre needs to be the right centre for you. So for instance, if you have at the centre of your mandala, let's say, give me an example.
Your children?
Yeah, okay. Well, if you have your children in the centre of your mandala, then anything that takes you away from your children is going to feel like you're not honouring your real mandala. But your life needs to have life without children as well, yeah? So how are you going to build a real life for yourself if at the centre of it is children and their needs? Yeah? How are you going to look after your needs as well if that's at the centre of the mandala? But if, for instance, you have, let's think, sensitivity in the centre of your mandala, like a value, then that will allow you to honour your relationships with your children, and yourself, and your work colleagues, for instance. Or if you have freedom, quality of freedom in the centre of your mandala, then you will try and maybe allow your children to learn the quality of freedom too. You will have communication with them that allows them to be freer and you to be freer of them. And it will allow you to build a life then it's based on more to do with, let's think what would be, values around, I'm going to say non-restriction, what would it be? Less ownership, less dominance, and more qualities that will be creative and see what's needed in every situation. So I'm putting this very ad-libbing quite a lot here. So just look at, what do you really have at the centre of your mandala? And is it broad enough to hold your life? And it might challenge your life, that's fine, but it needs to hold your life as well. Where is it working? So that's the sort of stuff we'll be looking at a bit later on in the retreat. Things like creativity. What does it look like to have a creative life? Creativity at the centre of your life. Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.